Okay. Welcome to, this is the Politics and Letters podcast, the second episode only. And today we're going to be talking to Jim Livingston and I, David Barfield, are going to be talking to Laura Kipnis, who is a prolific writer, a professor of media studies. Is that about right? And well, correct me in a minute. Let me get this out. Numerous books. She's an essayist. And as I was looking over her credentials, I just prefer the term social philosopher, might be good. And most recently has written a book called Love in the Time of Contagion, a Diagnosis, which deals with relationships during COVID. It's pretty topical. Can you want to add anything to that, Laura, or is that a?
Well, just to say that, I mean, maybe we'll get into this, that the way that I approach this idea of contagion is both about the pandemic, but exceeds the pandemic. So it becomes a more, both metaphorical and like larger sort of category about how people relate to each other. So, not just the pandemic.
Great.
That's the social part of the philosopher label, I think.
Yeah. Jim, did you want to?
Oh, yeah, I just think in the interest of full disclosure and whatever objectivity we might be able to approach in this venue, in this format, just want to say that this interview is unrehearsed, although I've seen several interviews, podcasts that Laura has done with other people about the book, Love in the Time of Contagion. But this one is unrehearsed. And the other thing that I think we need to disclose is that in the chapter on codependency in the new book, Love in the Time of Contagion, Laura describes in excruciating detail what she calls her cellmate, and I happen to be that prisoner. So we just want the audience to know that we're all aware of where we stand in this. And I might, if I may, a couple of people who have interviewed Laura have surmised that the relationship ended on the basis of what she wrote in the book. And I'm here to say that, to my knowledge, it is a relationship that is still intact. Laura, you can corroborate or not, as the case may be.
This is going to be so fun.
Yeah, well, there's absolutely no question that at bare minimum, it's a Zoom relationship. We got that. Yeah.
It's like couples therapy.
That's always, couples therapy is like for breakups. That's when it's, my disclosure is the following, is that actually I wanted to say, because it's related to certain themes that you write about in the book, but Jim and I have never met face to face. We became friends on Facebook, and then through a class that he offered up on Zoom to sit in on from California, the historiography class, I guess it was a seminar or class, and we became friendly through this sort of specific social situation, which was COVID, right? So we are a friendship, not love, right, in the romantic sense, but we were able to forge ahead with some sort of friendship this way. And so that at that time, when I think you were writing a lot of this, Jim was teaching the class. And so he was writing things on Facebook. The cellmate was a word that he would use on Facebook in class. And I knew of you through your prior book about the Title IX stuff, and then the name of it just escapes me.
Unwanted advances, sexual harm when it comes to campus.
Exactly. And I work at a university, and I live in Los Angeles, and I know about Occidental had its series of issues, and I read a good portion of that book. So I was aware of you, but I was not aware that you were the cellmate until some point in the process here, it became clear to me that it was you. And so when I started reading the book, I was like, oh yeah, I see. Like all this, like the color and three-dimensional stuff started happening. I started understanding a lot clearer about what Jim was talking about previously. At any rate, I saw you as like Jane Goodall, kind of, that, not
among the apes.
Yeah, well, like Jim is collecting leaves for a nap or something, and that observational part of it was intrinsic, right? Like that was a big part of how you approach this. And so one of the questions that Jim asked about, or we talked about asking, was, let me just make sure I get it straight, is can you talk about first person writing? Is that your go-to, or is it, did it feel natural for you in this circumstance? Or that's our question to you to start, is the process, right? Because I mean, clearly the conditions under which you started this project were not like normal times, right? When you might start out writing something.
Right. No, I've never been much of a first person writer. In the previous book that I wrote about love, Against Love, a polemic, I don't think people realize this, but there was zero first person in it. It was all second person, or you or we. So in no first person. And I'd actually only written really one first person essay for a book about writers who don't have children, that Megan Dahm edited. So it's not a natural mode for me. And I don't think of myself as really a confessional writer. And I had, like earlier in my career, I think sort of been, I don't know, influenced or maybe an acolyte of Susan Sontag's. And I like that kind of impersonal distance on a subject. And in a lot of ways, I still do. But for one thing, it did seem like a subject, talking about love in the time of contagion or pandemic times, you couldn't really write about it, or I felt I couldn't, from that kind of imperial distance. So I think, I had to write in the first person. And I mean, there was a way that I kind of, the Jane Goodall, reference is kind of apt because, I think that is true. I mean, even more so, obviously, under kind of lockdown quarantine situation, that you do become this observer anthropologist in your own life or your couple, if you're in a couple, whatever kind of domestic situation you're in. So it was gratifying to have this form, this book that I could like shovel a lot of those pent up, built up irritations and quote unquote observations, into that did become one of the kind of themes. Was that's not a criticism, that's an observation, so that was my line oftentimes. So, but yeah, no, I mean, one of the problems with first person, and I think it's, a sign of these times, is or indication of the times, once you start talking about yourself, it's hard to stop. Like, I don't know if I could write anymore not in the first person. It becomes like too much of a, of a lure and enticement. It's kind of gratifying and at this narcissistic kind of level. Oh, people are fascinated by me, even if they're not. But I will just say one other thing is that I think I did try to link that mode of writing in the first person to work that I've done in the past, where I actually am always trying to move between the personal and the larger kind of social situation or context. So I think that there are other books about, say, coupledom or marriage that are really very much confined to the personal sphere, where I think I was always actually trying to place the personal in the first person into kind of a larger social, political, economic, maybe even geopolitical kind of context, and make those associations.
Can I follow up on this here? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I love the question, and so far I like the answer. Can I push a little further though, and talk about those pronouns and what they mean, because with the possible exception of the female thing, where you do scale Olympian heights in observing what it means to be female, I think all of your books have you all over the page. I'll come back to the question of style, but I mean something more than the stylistics now, and that is, David called you a social philosopher, and I think that's right. I think that is right, and what you just said about trying to enlarge that sphere of the I or the we to the them, like what's going on in that world, and it is what is happening in my world, something like that. Can I speak to and for others? Okay, so I mean, I like to think of you as a moral philosopher in that sense, because even in Against Love, or especially in Against Love, and in this book as well, what you're allowing readers to do is to ask, what would I do in this circumstance? Or what happened to me under this circumstance? I mean, without the scholarly or the academic apparatus of moral philosophy, but still, you're asking people to ask themselves that question. Do you think of yourself in those terms? Because I mean, I certainly do, and I imagine that many of your readers do as well.
Well, I think that it goes further back in my work, because I was thinking back to what I think was actually my second book, Bound and Gagged, which is about pornography and the politics of fantasy in America is the subtitle, where I was interested in the ways that moral questions, I think, are posed within even this most degraded, popular cultural form, pornography,
Yeah.
that I think is very much about asking these questions about who we are, how we live, questions about, utopian aspirations and plenitude, and I mean, all sorts of things, but like coded in these other kinds of ways, like, the way that sex becomes an idiom for freedom in pornography. So, in trying to make the argument that pornography was a serious form of culture, which, in this book was maybe, 20 years ago or so, I think that I was trying to do that sort of maneuver that you're talking about, but I do think that popular culture generally is a version of moral philosophy. I mean, you can watch rom-coms, and, at Northwestern, in the film department, I taught rom-com production, like class, because I was teaching filmmaking. I taught that class many times, and even in rom-coms, let's say, are very much about the question of how to live. What you should be a risk taker, you should open your heart, you should, this, you should that. I mean, it's constantly kind of posing and giving advice, and even all sorts of comedies too. I mean, every form of popular culture, I think, is full of that sort of question, or those sorts of answers, like how do we live, how do we understand who we are in this life. So yes, I've tried to do that in my work, but I think I actually have learned about it maybe less from moral philosophers per se, because I'm not sure I've actually really read much, particularly, academic philosophy, but then in, thinking about it in relation to popular culture. And, as somebody like, say, Stanley Cavell does, who is one philosopher I've read, but in relation to popular culture, to romantic comedies of remarriage.
David, do you want to jump in there, or
Yeah,
I'll follow up?
Yeah, or no, go ahead, follow up. if you have something.
Okay. The first person, is often the whipping boy of people who believe in objectivity, and when objectivity gets defended, the personal essay often gets derided. You've described yourself in public many times as an essayist, and sometimes a personal essayist as well. Do you have any thoughts about that? About like, what is it? I mean, can you be objective? Do you even want to be objective in this kind of writing that you're doing? And with that first person in mind.
Yeah, I don't think objectivity is a term or a category that has ever meant that much to me. And, I mean, having been in the academy through the years, that there was this demand for people to kind of locate themselves, that there was really that critique or attack on the idea of objectivity or neutrality. And, coming out of, as I do, or having been, like, let's say, influenced by Marxist criticism, the idea of objectivity is sort of under attack from, this idea that, like, anything like that is ideological, steeped in ideology. So I think, I've never thought that wasn't true. So, I mean, I think those are somewhat different kinds of questions or issues, because the essay and the way that, people use their own experience to try to open on to larger questions. Nobody's ever used the term objectivity as a critique of that, I wouldn't think.
Right.
But I'll just say something else. I mean, I think that even in things that I've written that are not in the first person, I think you said something before about me being all over the page. I mean, I've always been very interested in a writing style that has a kind of personal feel to it, so I've not ever been interested in that kind of real proper kind of writing that pretends to be dispassionate or neutral or something like that. I'm interested in a voicey sort of writing. And so I think that I like to think anyway that there's a sense of a presence of a writer in even like things that I've written that are not in the first person.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Could I,
David?
yeah, no, I wanted to jump back a little bit to the moral philosophy topic, and related, or just maybe as a way in, was I'll say my observation about your writing and thinking is that it seems to me to be, well, I'll just say, I believe you are an egalitarian, right? At your core, that sort of comes across in your writing. And I'm imagining that over time, and people reviewing your books, at maybe the last two, you may have gotten, or this isn't actually my question, have you gotten pushback on that aspect of your argument? Or am I wrong about that?
Can you say a little more what you mean by egalitarian? Because I mean, I don't think you mean like socialist. So I'm not quite sure. Do you mean I don't believe in hierarchy, or what would you mean by egalitarian?
Back to the prior book, in Unwanted Advances, it seemed, and there's a little bit in the Me Too aspects that come up in this book, that you seem to argue for that people should be treated fairly, sort of in a before we judge them, kind of, before people are like cast out to sea or whatever we do with them, that there should be a sort of an assessment of the level of harm that people engage in. Whether, I think you mentioned, that there's a difference between Harvey Weinstein and somebody who just tells a joke, right?
Right.
And that,
yeah, so I mean, I think what you're talking about is like proceduralism, and it's complicated because in relation to Me Too, because obviously one of the ways that movement became necessary and was necessary was because the procedures that were in place weren't adequate to deal with the kinds of, things that were happening, particularly things that were happening in private, so that didn't rise to the standard of evidence and proof that were required, like, for something to be prosecuted legally. So, there's that side of it that, and this was said of rape laws, for quite some time, that, that you've got that term, he said, she said, and so, there was never this kind of adequate set of procedures to address those kinds of situations, and there probably still isn't. So, that's one side of it. And so you had the internet and, kind of taking in or stepping over social media became this means for people, mostly women, who felt there wasn't another avenue to address these kind of horrendous things that had happened to them. So that's one side of it. But I mean, I became, and I talk about this in the new book and elsewhere, it became kind of disappointed in the movement because the kinds of, let's say, affronts or, things that people were kind of taking other people down for, attempting to take other people down for, didn't seem to rise to the standard of the punishments that were being inflicted, I guess, if I can say it that way. So, so both things are the case. The procedures still aren't adequate to address shitty things that happen to people, mostly women, people in private. And, but then the other side of it too, that, the mobbing sorts of things that happen on Twitter, let's say, with very little evidence to support the kinds of claims that are made against somebody, are oftentimes really egregious also. Right. So, I mean, it's a big mess.
So, but that in either case, whether we're talking about the inadequate avenues for redressing grievances or for having people's lives destroyed on Twitter or whatever, or at least made more difficult, you are still, there's a calling for some form of reasonable justice or something, or proportionality, I guess, a consideration of what extents people cause harm and are harmed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's again complicated thing, because sure, I would say in the abstract, I believe in proportionality, absolutely, but then it's sometimes hard to assess, and here in legal terms, people fall back on the reasonable person kind of standard. Would a reasonable person think this was an affront? But who is the reasonable person? Here we get back to these old universalisms, like, is the reasonable person a man who,
right.
So it's hard. These are very difficult questions. Yeah, I mean, and what I think is a reasonable person or a reasonable response to an affront, I have been called, like, say, that people have called me even a rape apologist for wanting there to be proceduralism, like, say, in Title IX proceedings.
Right.
So it's very complicated, particularly on campus at this moment where, even in officialese, and I like talk about this in Unwanted Advances, you have coming from these offices, that are part of the, university structure, say, calling people survivors who have made a claim, like somebody who files a Title IX complaint will get referred to as a survivor even prior to there being a finding in the case,
Right.
So, like, that was something I noticed.
Well, here, now that we've opened up the terrain of politics, let's go there and do some more mapping and exploration. Maybe not in that order. The through line, it seems to me, in all of your books and essays is feminism. But you often refer to yourself as a residually Marxist thinker. And you mentioned Marxist art criticism as one of the inspirations and influences early on in your career. Can you talk about that? Like, those sort of intellectual origins and how they've evolved in your work. Is it? I mean, am I right to say that feminism is the through line and Marxism is an adjunct to that, or?
I'm a proud vulgar Marxist. I mean, I do think the economy is the determining thing in the last instance, or whatever, So, I mean, I was very influenced by Marxist feminism, and there's just very little of it around anymore. I mean, this was British, kind of the British Marxist feminism of maybe the 80s, that really had a lot of focus on the family and the economics of the family. So, I mean, I think I do always, in my thinking or analysis, as to the extent that I analyze anything, I'm always kind of going back to that, those influences and thinking about the economics. And I was also very influenced by the work of Frederick Jameson, who I encountered at these sort of Marxist summer camps that I go to that were under the auspices of something called the Marxist Literary Group, many decades ago. And Fred's work influenced me a lot because of the way that he, makes these kind of leaps from the cultural to the economic to the political, or sees them in a kind of homology with each other. That's the term I think that gets used by him or about him. So I think, that was a kind of influence and license to see those levels, the way they kind of interact or map onto or structure each other. So to that extent, I mean, would say yes. I mean, I would say maybe not that the feminism precedes the Marxism or post, right. I don't know. It's all in there somehow. Yeah. But also you have to say, I'm very unsystematic in this. I don't come out of any academic discipline. I went to art schools, as you mentioned. So I did not have that kind of, I don't know what, yoke, I guess, that, people who come out of the disciplines and did a PhD and had a committee and, got certain kinds of rigor and discipline hammered into them, so I think I've been able to range more freely among, disciplines and thinkers and ideas and kind of cobble together, in a maybe supermarket fashion, what seems adequate to whatever I'm working on.
Well, in that sense, then you can be a partisan of identity politics, but that doesn't ever exclude class struggle from your conspectus on what politics is and means and can include. Yeah,
and I mean, it also, I've had a kind of impatience also with the sort of maybe more identitarian versions of identity politics, because I think I was also very influenced, given the times that, age and places and intellectual movements that were around when I came of age, which was post-structuralism, postmodernism, maybe post-Marxism to some extent. And queer theory too, also. I mean, I would want to put that in there, but it was a kind of anti-identitarian version of queer theory, where I think the versions that are more prominent now have really reverted back to this kind of a kind of narrow version of identity politics. You can't talk about this subject if you're not an X, So, those always have seemed kind of intellectually narrowing as opposed to expanding in the way that the, earlier strands of queer theory always seemed intellectually really lively and enlivening to me, as did feminism really in those days.
Sure. Yeah. David, you got?
Yeah, well, the identitarian remark got me thinking, and I had a question, but I was going to bring it back to the book a little bit, but maybe this would be a good time to ask about Zelda, who, as I was reading about her, you made me, and I assume that this was intentional, really very anxious as I was reading through it. I know, I mean, I work with young people at a university, you know, so I don't want to say I'm hip or anything like that, but I'm tuned into like a lot of let's scratch out tuned in. I'm aware of the ways in which they communicate with one another and the sort of traps that I think that they can fall into with getting a little bit absorbed in what would you call it, public sort of airing of their selves and all their intimate details through social media. Do you think that I don't know how to put this. When I look at that kind of, I felt it was very boundaryless, like as a group of friends might be able to sort of confine their gripes with one another to a more private medium, like just maybe talking to one another. So it kind of bothered me on that level. But do you think that this is like, is this just a natural outgrowth of the same stuff we've been seeing among young people forever? And that, I guess, social media is just making it more illuminated or something? Or I guess what I knew how it made me feel, right? And I felt very anxious by it. Like I said, when you were listening to her tell you these stories, were you concerned for her, or did it just appear like another way of interacting with people? You know, that, I mean, we do it too, right? We're on.
Sure. I should just explain a little bit about this chapter. So one of the interesting things that did happen during lockdown or, you know, quarantine, whatever we were in, was, you know, I did end up having these Zoom conversations with different people that I wouldn't necessarily, you know, have spent as much time with. So a former student of mine who is Black, queer, millennial, and somebody I've stayed in touch with over the years. She's probably maybe around 27 now. And so since she graduated, we've stayed in touch and been friendly. And we, you know, we're catching up by Zoom during the lockdown, and then ended up kind of continuing this conversation every week for a couple of months. And I got her permission at some point because she was telling these stories about her circle of friends and her love life, which was with women that she would meet online and hook up with and then move in with and then, you know, break up with. So there was this kind of procession of people in her life that she was talking about. And I became kind of fascinated by these stories. You know, I referred to as a Scheherazade at one point, you know, early on. I said not knowing if she knew the reference. But anyway, so she was okay with me recording our conversations and writing about her and her friends. So it was this kind of almost circus of people and complications, but most of it getting played out on social media over Twitter and Instagram and this thing that she called Finsta, which are fake Instagram accounts. And this constant drama that this circle of people who all seem to have known each other, and a lot of them had slept with each other at different points, and they would break up and then get back together and then like tweet about their breakups. And so everybody knew what everybody was doing, and it all played out online. So that's just to kind of sketch the backdrop of what, you know, you're talking about. I mean, you know, I guess one of the questions in the chapter is about technology and its effect on intimacy and our intimacies. And, you know, I was like a bit at risk of sounding like this, you know, aging out of it person, because I'm not or wasn't that much on social media. Did it make me anxious about her? I suppose in a way, I guess you'd have to say it made me anxious for the fate of all of us. I mean, I think that even people who aren't on social media that much, it is very addicting, you know, like the rush of seeing the likes add up on a Facebook post or a tweet. And so what seemed like it was happening for this Zelda and her circle was that the online life seemed to be more like valuable or enticing than the in-person life. So like one of her relationships, she would talk about, like, she'd be in the same room with this woman that she was involved with, and the woman would be tweeting about her and saying, or tweeting how depressed and upset she was. And then Zelda would be like, hey, I'm right here in the room. You know, but the girlfriend was, you know, wanted more. She wanted something that was out there in, you know, on Twitter that was like kind of more meaningful to her than the relationships in the room. So, you know, it was a larger question about technology, but also not just the way we are kind of volunteering to conduct our emotional lives online, but also all of the forms of surveillance, government and corporate surveillance that come along with digital capitalism, or the surveillance state, you know, that are kind of reshaping us into people who, you know, have no choice about the surveillance that we're subjected to all the time. I mean, you can barely participate in the economy. I mean, you can't participate in the economy without kind of revealing all of your interior life online practically. You know, I make a joke about all the security questions. So, I mean, I think this is, you know, all of our condition to various extents, and certainly the condition of life in the future. So it makes me concerned and fretful, not just about her and her friends, but about what, you know, all of our lives are becoming.
Yeah, the thing that I can think of, that the thing that really made me sort of, that tweaked me the most, was the sort, you used this actually in an essay you wrote, social snitch. You used the word snitch recently in a writing. And there was an aspect of that with Zelda's friends as well, of catching each other in these compromising or hypocritical situations, or whatever their thing was. And that it just, yeah, I don't know, that was that I walked away with that as what disturbed me most about it.
Yeah, they're all trying to call each other out.
Yeah.
You know, show the people what you did. You know, I think I'm kind of paraphrasing something Zelda said. And yeah, I wrote an essay recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education about, is academia become a hotbed of craven snitches?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, and it was, yeah, there was a sort of influence there. I mean, it was something I've been thinking about with she and her circle of friends, that a kind of carceral punitive mentality that, you know, I talk about the screenshotting was something fascinating that I learned from her, that, you know, they're just constantly screenshotting each other's posts and storing them away so that if, you know, they can bring them up and repost them at a later date, you know, having the receipts on someone. So there is this gotcha kind of attitude, but it's also quite similar or identical to what I was writing about in Unwanted Advances, you know, all the kind of rise of this punitive culture on campus, even, you know, both at the official levels and unofficial levels. You know, so, you know, and the irony, and I was trying to point this out in the Snitches essay, is that, you know, you've got all these supposed social justice kinds of people who are anti-carceral and, you know, want to defund the police and close the prisons and everything, but are, you know, perfectly happy to use institutional mechanisms to turn people in and hopefully cause them to lose their jobs for like a tweet that is a misfired joke. You know,
Right.
so
Right.
it's, no, it's kind of horrifying.
Yeah, it sort of dovetailed too with your earlier discussion about codependency, I thought that there's this, they need each other in this respect, right? You have to have, if you're going to be a snitch, you need a criminal, right? Or you need a somebody
You need an
violating.
authority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You need some institution to report it to. Yeah, the transgression. Can I follow up with that? Go ahead.
Pardon? Yeah, please.
Okay. No, I mean, I love it when you start talking about capitalism, especially surveillance capitalism, because one of the recurring themes in your work is the proliferation, if you will, of the narcissistic personality type. But it sounds, listening to David talk about that chapter and listening to you talk about it as well, I mean, this stage of capitalism is creating, requiring, eliciting a new personality type, which has all the earmarks of the narcissistic personality. That is to say, a being, a sentient being at that whose subjectivity, whose interiority is emptied out. There's nothing private left, in part because the personality doesn't want it. It doesn't want or need any privacy, in part because it is constantly elicited by these media and the stage of capitalism that goes along with it. Which brings me, please comment on that if you would like, but that I think is a good transition to another version of my question about your politics, and that is the politics of transgression. That always, from the early writings on pornography, Hustler and so forth, but the first two books, up until your essay for Liberties of last year, I believe it was, on your elegy for transgression. I wonder if you could talk about that, that what is it, you've been writing about transgressive acts and the political implications thereof, or the political premises thereof, for your entire career. I wonder if you could just, explore that with us.
Yeah, no, it very much comes out of having had this art school education, and I've written about this, a class I took in modern art history at some point. Actually early on when I was in art school, that influenced me a lot. And it has been a feature of a lot of things that I've written. I'd written this essay on Larry Flint in Hustler magazine that was in one of the early cultural studies volumes that had come out of this big conference at University of Illinois. And that kind of launched me, I think, it launched me into writing about pornography, because I was interested in the way, at that point, it seemed kind of transgressive and interesting in the way that it violated, not just sexual mores, but a lot of the aesthetic mores and norms. So I was kind of interested in its aesthetic transgression. So it was a kind of continuation of the stuff that I've been interested in and learned about in art school. And then, more recently, the piece for Liberties, a transgression and elegy. I mean, it does seem to me that the transgressive, like, let's say, I don't know, imperative or celebrations, have moved from, there was a kind of assumption that was made by the people I was involved with, that transgression was a kind of, I don't know, left wing, always had this kind of anti-bourgeois and thus possibly anti-capitalist, but, it was anti-establishment, let's say. That was its politics, its modality. And there was a kind of assumption that those modes in the cultural sphere had some kind of political valence, like that they were aligned with revolutionary or radical kinds of politics. And then, as you see what has happened more recently, it's the left, or let's say the social justice left, which I'm never ever sure if that is actually the left, you know, has become, again, particularly on campus, you know, the people policing the transgressions, you know, policing the jokes on Twitter, or policing the comedians, or, you know, it's become this kind of more invested in correctness and, you know, setting the cultural tone. And it's weirdly the right that, you know, has become these transgressors. I mean, people like Steve Bannon, or, I mean, these people are transgressing proprieties and social norms left and right, you know, including aesthetically. And that book, Angela Nagle's book about the Kill All the Normies, you know, where she talks about online culture and the kind of origins of that sort of trolling and the 4chan and the, I forget, you know, Peppy the Frog memes. And, you know, I can't remember it all right offhand, but, you know, that sort of turn where the transgressive forces and the, you know, that would probably feed into Trump and the MAGA movement, you know, had started out as these kinds of in these online worlds, you know, where you couldn't quite tell the politics of this thing, but it had a lot to do with violating proprieties, let's say. So this is, I mean, I'm not being very clear here, but there was a kind of turn in a movement that upset the things that, you know, the art world and me as a product of the art world kind of assumed or thought was the case about what transgression was about and meant. Sorry, that was like kind of a, you know, that was a part hard to put together.
No, I mean, it was rambling, but it was cool. It made sense. I mean, come on.
So
I mean, that whole, I tie that to, you know, Jim mentioned the narcissism that arises. Every time I encounter this, Zelda brought it out in me quite a bit, but I always go back, I think of R.D. Laing, right? And had this conception of the ego, like as a structure, right? Like as a solid thing. When the permeations in that ego are caused by trauma, right? Or at least this is the way I recall it from college. But that those permeations affirm a solid ego, like give people, or like prevent people from understanding where they begin and end, you know, and that everything becomes this, in the DSM, right, there's the borderline personality disorder is very, just to use the played out expression or the played out diagnosis. But I worked in the mental health field for a long time. I used to talk to borderlines regularly, people with that disorder, and I would see it. You know, you could see how they had a very difficult time looking at somebody else's mishigas, right? And then, but they couldn't help but take it in and like feel it personally. And that kind of sense of self, I think, which gets squashed under capitalism, in my view, as probably a longer conversation, but actually also ties back to something Jim was talking about on Facebook not long ago about about AA and how instead of grasping like the really progressive elements of religiosity that have once been, you know, that they came up with the idea of the individual, of autonomous individuals, right? They reach for powerlessness instead. And I think that those two, the thing with Zelda, just I'll go back to Zelda and to a lot of the snitches that you're referring to, social justice warrior snitches, maybe it's the better warrior snitch. It reminds me, they have a lot of those characteristics, it seems to me, that it's that a friend once said to me, you know, being right ain't all it's cracked up to be, right? Like sometimes you're just going to have to say, you know what, that guy's a fucking racist and there's nothing we can do about it. And we're just going to have to like have a politics and move on or do whatever, you know. But that when you start bringing everyone else's problems into your own world, you start seeing it acted out institutionally, like in these cases, you know, in the universities and so forth. I see it here actually quite often. That's rambling and not exactly what I wanted to say, but sort of trying to get at that. I thought Zelda really held your book together, like in that, in a lot of ways, like everything sort of like in one way or the other ran through her.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I guess one thing I would say,
I'm sorry, not all bad either. I mean, like it just, yeah.
I loved writing that. And I know some people, particularly older people, thought we're like appalled. You know, I heard people be appalled about Zelda and her friends, and yeah, the confusion, the chaos. The chapter is called Love and Chaos. I mean, one of the points that I make, or in passing in that chapter, where I try to step back and be a bit of a media theorist, is to point out that, you know, you've got this show in, I think it's 1999, Big Brother, which was like the first reality show where you've got, you know, people living in this house, and this was in the Netherlands. So you got people living in this house and being watched all the time by, you know, hidden cameras, and playing out these, I don't know, like social life and confrontations with this group of people in this enclosed space. And, you know, one of the interesting things, okay, so it's 1999, you know, then you got 9/11 that happens a couple of years later, which provides its political justification for these increasing levels of surveillance. And then you've got the invention of Facebook and these other sort of social media platforms where people are, I think it's Jim was saying, like starting to empty their interior lives onto screens and interacting on screens with each other. And at the same time, you've got the rise of reality television as this form and dominance where people become habituated to and rewarded for dumping all of their emotional lives onto, you know, screens and cameras and everything. And that becomes more and more normalized. So, I mean, I think that there just absolutely is this shift in personality type or character structure such that, you know, there's less, you know, to go back to that, you know, phrase, inner compass of the 50s personality that, sorry, help me out, the inner, Reisman talks about. Yeah, so I mean, I think, yes, character structures have transformed, and I don't know how, I don't want to be too deterministic, because it does seem it's all of the, you know, it's the social, it's the interpersonal, it's the cultural and media, it's the economic, you know, all of these forces are collaborating to produce this world that Zelda and her friends inhabit, you know. And, you know, who are we, this older generation, to look at them and say, oh, but this is not an adequate kind of emotional life you're living. Ours, you know, our mode was better. You know, you can't, there's no putting it back in the bottle, so to speak.
That is right. Yeah, it's an evolution, not necessarily a devolution in that sense. Yeah.
I mean, I'm enough of a pessimist also, though, sorry, not to just argue with you, but no, I mean, I do think everything's getting worse at the same time, because I do think, you know, it's capitalism has, you know, dictated that. I mean, there's things that get better, like, you know, they'll bring you products to your home the next day after you order it, and you don't have to leave the house, and, you know, that's very convenient. But, you know, so there's certain kinds of rewards, which is, you know, consumerism is this consolation. We get to buy things cheaper and faster. But in terms of, like, you know, part of this thing we keep going back to about the carceral conditions on campus and this kind of supervisory regime that's, you know, both like unprocedural, and the ways that people enjoy these kind of authoritarian pleasures of turning people in, you know, that kind of thing. So I mean, I think yeah, I don't have the sense anything's getting better.
Yeah. Well, can we talk about style now? And maybe you want to, you know, talk about the politics of style. Unless, David, did you want to follow up with that?
No, I agree. Everything's getting worse.
Okay.
No, I'll tell you a really quick anecdote. I just was sitting in a town hall meeting for the diversity and inclusion task force, was talking to students, and the provost came in and basically told a kid that, a student that we don't really, there's not much we can do about professors who offend students, because they're really unionized and they're all old fashioned and they just can't get their heads around the idea that their job security is not as important as you being offended. And I was just there sort of as a fly on the wall, and my jaw hit the ground. But I told this to some friends of mine, and they, who follow this administrators a little more closely than I do, and they were like, "Yeah, that's where it's at," And that. So I think that even in the places where you go to look for help, like the justice people are, it's not just, it's the opposite. And I think capitalism, like we talked about before, it's stripped out autonomy, it's stripped out all this stuff, it's squashed our personalities, but we're also become completely uncritical. And so that I could end up with a provost at a major American university who would say something like that publicly, anyway, that's just.
Let's not divulge your place of work now, okay?
I don't give a shit anymore.
All right.
No, it's all right. I actually do, but
right.
I'm secure enough, I think.
All right. Well, on to the politics of style, or the non-politics of style. We all know that you're a brilliant writer and a very persuasive essayist. So let me put the question of style to you this way. I used to think that the difference between fiction and nonfiction is that in fiction, the writer persuades without argument. That is to say, he or she convinces you that this fictional world is an inhabitable world where there are laws of motion that actually make sense, and that you could actually live there, at least for the time being in your imagination, but yeah, maybe someday. And now I'm not so sure, because in studying your style over these years, I find that you're not writing fiction, but you're not writing nonfiction in a social science mode, and that your style persuades us without you making an argument on behalf of either the style or the content of the sentences that you write. So could you talk about, how do you think of as your style, or what is a sense of style in a writer? Maybe you could cite a favorite writer or something. I don't know. It just, it really strikes me that you've got a brand there, if I may indulge the the prototypical word of consumer culture.
Well, thank you. I think it's something I started thinking about when I was writing the book Against Love, because I had this idea that I was writing, the subject of the book was, or a lot of it was about adultery and people fleeing marriages or domestic coupledom for these kind of non-domestic kinds of couples, where you would find freedom, and like the book was against the heart, the idea of love takes work or relationships take work, and it was kind of more invested in this idea of playing around and, posit playing around as a kind of value as opposed to the hard work of, domestic coupledom. And I guess I ended up thinking that and something about setting it up that way made the language kind of flow and unfold and become very metaphoric. And I found these metaphors would just kind of keep spinning out in these weird directions that I would follow. So there was a kind of id-like quality, I thought, in the tone that I figured out. And I did start feeling like I was writing from the id, or at least on behalf of the id, as opposed to the superego or, or the ego, the like, let's reconcile reconcile ourselves to the hard work of whatever. So I think that was when I really started thinking a lot about style. And I do think that book, there's a kind of way that the subject matter and the voice of it, the style of it merged in a way that I've never quite been able to get back to, I think. Because it was, the subject was such a perfect one for that. But I guess, to go back to the question you brought up earlier about moral philosophy, I mean, I think there is a argument that's made at the level of style there for freedom, and I guess I do think about that, like the freedom in a sentence, like the freedom on the page, the freedom for a sentence to go off in these unexpected directions. And is a freedom that we're kind of bequested from our imaginations. And I guess if I have any kind of moral position, it is that is something we come equipped with, this kind of inbuilt sense of the possibilities of rebellion and pleasure and playfulness, and it is that kind of id quality. So I think that is always something I'm trying to achieve via style. So it is, I think you're right, like it's an argument without an argument, because it's an argument that's made, almost sometimes, I guess, illicitly too, because you can kind of I mean, I've noticed you doing this in your writing recently, like a lot of the metaphors in Against Love were about the domestic couple is this premature cemetery, it was kind of like, there's a lot of graveyard, rotting denture kind of metaphors. Like we were talking about, like, what was it? Maturity is a kind of denture adhesive, so there's a way, like, I mean, it's a sort of simile metaphor. Like if you can find this most disgusting thing to compare something to, you're making an argument without making an argument. If mature love is a denture adhesive, well, who wants that?
Yeah. David?
Wait a minute.
We've got over an hour's worth. I hope you can add what I just said.
I had one question that's maybe unanswerable, but I had to ask it just because I know the protagonist and now, and or one of them. Did Jim make this book inevitable?
I always have a fantasy of writing a book about Jim.
I think you should.
Well, I think I did. I mean, to the extent, I wrote a chapter,
right,
the codependency chapter, and he was very gracious about not, wanting me to pull any punches, I guess. But I mean, I think did he make it inevitable? Jim has a towering personality.
Well, I feel like
you make me sound like a natural disaster.
Yeah. Well, what I know of Jim is that there's basically no topic that you can't go to, right? There's no criticism. This is just my observation over the past year or whatever, or that we've had interaction, is that Jim loves ideas and he loves batting these things around, and that makes a great subject. I figure, so if you're locked in a cell with somebody, that it's that kind of being locked in with somebody like that is different than being locked in with a person who's not interested in, or not provocative. So that's why I was just, again, this was one of my secret ins here that I had, and that as I was reading the book, I thought to myself, yeah, this kind of makes sense to me, that these things would be coming out of you or somebody even observing Jim. But that's really my question. So It's maybe not
Yeah.
answerable. I don't know.
He was a great gift to me as a writer, but it's
As
like,
a cellmate, though.
well, I was saying as a writer, you're always looking for this kind of subject that sort of unfolds. I mean, that was, what was great about talking to Zelda, my student. It was, there would be a lot of people you would talk to on Zoom and it would be like, okay, that's it. There's no place else to go. But hers was a story that just kept unfolding.
Right.
And, I guess it was the same with Jim. There was a story that kept unfolding. And, and there's another chapter in the book. Well, sorry, it's the same chapter. The first part is about another set of conversations I had with a friend I call Mason, about him having broken up with his wife, who was an alcoholic. And it was the same thing because his story, he just had a lot of eloquence about it. And so it just kept on unfolding. But not everyone is like that. There's just not everyone. There are people who are more imploded or their stories are less interesting. I have to say, and again, Jim was generous about this. One of the things in that chapter that is I feel like the things I like the most that I've written is about Jim's mother, who I've never met. She died long before we met, but it was thinking about her life. And, but this is all secondhand because I've heard about her life from Jim, but it was something that was really compelling for me to write about. So yeah, there is, the idea of being walked in with somebody that provides a lot of material was a kind of gift as a writer.
Yeah.
Okay, we better stop right there.
Okay. Well, Laura Kipnis, thank you so much for talking with us today. And,
thank you to both of you.
You were quite welcome. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.